December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The snow fell thick and relentless across the Belgian wilderness, blanketing the landscape in a deceptive silence that masked the chaos brewing beneath. The German Wehrmacht had launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, a massive, desperate counteroffensive designed to split the Allied forces, recapture Antwerp, and turn the tide of a war already slipping through Hitler's fingers. The Führer had gambled everything on this audacious strike, throwing 3 armies and over 200,000 men into a brutal winter assault that caught the Allies completely off guard. At the heart of this maelstrom stood the small Belgian town of Bastogne, a critical crossroads where 7 major roads converged. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the flow of men, supplies, and armor through the Ardennes. And trapped inside that frozen pocket of hell were 18,000 American soldiers, most of them from the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded by 5 German divisions with overwhelming firepower, dwindling ammunition, and winter closing in like a vice. General Omar Nelson Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, sat in his headquarters in Luxembourg City, staring at maps that told a story of disaster. Bradley was the antithesis of flamboyance, a methodical, calculated strategist who believed in careful planning, logistical superiority, and the grinding attrition of total war. He was Eisenhower's most trusted ground commander, the GI general who rose through competence rather than charisma, a man who valued reliability over brilliance, steadiness over spectacle. But December 1944 was testing every assumption Bradley had built his career upon. The German offensive had shattered his lines, isolated entire divisions, and created a crisis that demanded not just competence, but genius and speed. The 101st Airborne was running out of time. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Artillery shells were being rationed. The wounded lay in makeshift aid stations with no morphine, no plasma, no hope of evacuation. German tanks prowled the perimeter, probing for weakness, tightening the noose hour by hour. And then there was Patton, Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr., warrior, poet, mystic, profane prophet of armored warfare. The man who believed he had fought in past lives, who wrote poetry about death and glory, who slapped shell-shocked soldiers and wept over the graves of his men. Patton commanded the 3rd Army, positioned south of the Bulge, driving eastward toward Germany when the crisis erupted. He was everything Bradley was not: impulsive, theatrical, brilliant in flashes of tactical inspiration that bordered on clairvoyance. He was also dangerous, a man whose ego could derail operations, whose temper could ignite political firestorms, whose mouth could end careers with a single inflammatory quote. Bradley and Patton shared a complicated history. They had been classmates at West Point, colleagues in the interwar years, brothers in arms in North Africa and Sicily. But their relationship was layered with tension, professional respect wrapped around personal friction, admiration tangled with resentment. Bradley had been Patton's superior in Sicily, tasked with managing his volatile subordinate's brilliance while containing his recklessness. Now, in December 1944, their roles had evolved, but the dynamic remained. Bradley needed what Patton could do, even as he dreaded what Patton might say or demand in return. When Eisenhower called his senior commanders to an emergency conference at Verdun on December 19th, the atmosphere was grim. The Supreme Commander needed solutions, and he needed them immediately. The 101st Airborne had been surrounded for days. General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the Trap Division, had famously responded to German surrender demands with a single word: nuts. It was defiant, memorable, destined for the history books, but defiance alone wouldn't break a siege. The paratroopers needed relief, and the only force positioned to reach them was Patton's 3rd Army. The problem was physics and logistics. Patton's entire army was oriented eastward, driving eastward along a broad front. To relieve Bastogne, he would need to disengage from combat, pivot his entire force 90 degrees northward, traverse icy roads in the worst winter in decades, and attack into the southern flank of the German offensive, all while maintaining supply lines, coordination, and momentum. Military doctrine suggested such a maneuver would take weeks of preparation. Patton claimed he could do it in 48 hours. Bradley sat in that conference room watching Patton perform, because that's what it was, a performance. Patton stood before the map, radiating confidence, his voice sharp and certain, laying out an audacious plan to wheel 3 full divisions north and smash through to Bastogne within days. It was vintage Patton, bold, precise, bordering on arrogant. Eisenhower, desperate for options, seized on it. Bradley said nothing,
but his mind was calculating, analyzing, weighing the risks of failure against the catastrophe of inaction. What Bradley understood, perhaps better than anyone in that room, was that Patton had already begun planning the relief of Bastogne days before the conference, before anyone had officially asked him to. Patton's intelligence officers had war-gamed the scenario, his logistics staff had pre-positioned supplies, his division commanders had been briefed on contingency plans. This wasn't improvisation, it was preparation disguised as spontaneity, calculation masked by bravado. Patton wanted everyone to believe he was a military savant who could conjure miracles on demand. Bradley knew better. This was staff work, foresight, and ruthless efficiency hidden behind a stage persona. And that knowledge created a peculiar tension in Bradley's mind, a mixture of irritation and admiration, skepticism and hope.
The pivot began on December 22, 1944. 3 divisions, over 133,000 men, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, began one of the most complex military maneuvers of the entire war. The 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division disengaged from their positions along the Saar River, turned north, and began the grueling march through frozen terrain toward the southern approaches of Bastogne. The roads were sheets of ice, visibility was near zero. German aircraft, emboldened by rare clear skies, strafed columns whenever the cloud cover broke. Yet Patton's army moved with a speed that defied conventional military wisdom, a testament to the relentless drilling, preparation, and iron discipline hidden beneath Patton's theatrical exterior. Bradley watched this unfold from his headquarters with the cold assessment of a man who had seen too many operations fail for lack of follow-through. He had approved the plan because there was no alternative, but approval and confidence were not the same thing. Bradley understood the stakes with crystalline clarity. If Patton failed to reach Bastogne, the 101st Airborne would be annihilated. The political and psychological impact would be devastating. McAuliffe's defiant nuts would transform from legend into epitaph. The German offensive might gain enough momentum to reach the Meuse River, potentially fracturing the Allied coalition and prolonging the war by months, perhaps years. But Bradley's concerns extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. He was thinking institutionally, politically, strategically. Patton was already a media phenomenon, a darling of war correspondents who needed heroes to feed a public hungry for victory narratives. If Patton succeeded in relieving Bastogne, the press would crown him the savior of the Ardennes, the general who single-handedly turned the tide. The headlines would write themselves, the publicity would be overwhelming, and Patton's already inflated ego, an ego that had caused diplomatic incidents, personnel crises, and command headaches throughout the European campaign, would become utterly unmanageable. Bradley had spent considerable political capital controlling Patton's worst repulses. The slapping incidents in Sicily, where Patton physically struck soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, had nearly ended his career and required Eisenhower's direct intervention to contain. Patton's public statements comparing Nazi SS troops favorably to American political parties in occupied Bavaria had created a firestorm that required damage control at the highest levels. His tendency to ignore supply limitations, exceed operational boundaries, and pursue glory over operational objectives had repeatedly forced Bradley into the uncomfortable position of reining in his most effective field commander. Now, in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, Bradley faced a paradox that would define his assessment of Patton for the rest of his life. He needed Patton to succeed desperately, even as he dreaded the consequences of that success. The relief operation was not, despite popular mythology, a one-man show. Bradley knew this intimately. The entire logistical apparatus of the Third Army had been mobilized with brutal efficiency. Supply officers worked round the clock to reroute fuel, ammunition, and rations. Engineers laid temporary bridges across frozen streams. Medical units established forward aid stations to handle the inevitable casualties. Communication officers maintained tenuous radio links through weather that scrambled signals in grounded aircraft. This was total war requiring total coordination, the unglamorous staff work that made operations possible but never captured headlines. Yet when Bradley reviewed the operation in his mind, he couldn't deny the singular importance of Patton's leadership style in this specific context. The speed of the Third Army's pivot wasn't just logistics, it was culture. Patton had built an organizational ethos around aggression, speed, and relentless forward momentum. His division commanders didn't wait for perfect conditions or complete information. They attacked, knowing that Patton would support audacity and punish hesitation. His junior officers took initiative because the alternative was facing Patton's legendary wrath. His enlisted men endured impossible conditions because Patton had convinced them they were warriors in a great crusade, not cogs in a bureaucratic machine.
Bradley, the methodical staff officer who had risen through competence and careful planning, recognized something in Patton that he himself lacked and could never cultivate: the ability to inspire men to exceed their perceived limitations through sheer force of personality. It was irrational, unscientific, impossible to replicate through doctrine or training manuals, and it was devastatingly effective in specific circumstances. December 26, 1944, the 4th Armored Division, spearheaded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, smashed through the German encirclement and reached Bastogne. The siege was broken. The 101st Airborne, battered but unbroken, had held. Patton's impossible promise had been fulfilled. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks, grinding toward Allied victory through attrition and overwhelming material superiority, but the psychological turning point had arrived. The German offensive had been halted. The Third Army had accomplished what military professionals had deemed impossible. And Bradley sat in his headquarters, receiving reports, updating situation maps, coordinating the broader counteroffensive, and wrestling with a complex emotional and intellectual response that he would spend the rest of his life attempting to articulate. There was relief, certainly. The 101st had been saved. The strategic crisis had been contained. The German gamble had failed. But threading through that relief was something darker, more complicated, a recognition that history would remember this moment as Patton's triumph, not Bradley's. The careful planning, the logistical coordination, the strategic positioning that had made the relief possible would fade into background noise. The public narrative would center on one man, one dramatic pivot, one seemingly miraculous rescue. Bradley was not a man prone to jealousy in the petty sense, but he was acutely aware of legacy. He understood how history was written, reputations were built, how individual narratives overshadowed institutional accomplishments. The relief of Bastogne would become myth, and myths required heroes, singular, identifiable, quotable heroes. Patton fit that role perfectly. Bradley, by temperament and design, did not. What troubled Bradley most deeply was not envy, but a growing recognition of a fundamental tension in modern warfare: the conflict between the theatrical and the competent, between the commanders who captured imagination and the commanders who won wars through grinding, unglamorous attrition.
The aftermath of Bastogne revealed truths that Bradley found simultaneously vindicating and disturbing. In the weeks following the relief operation, as journalists descended on the front lines hunting for stories and heroes, the narrative solidified with predictable velocity. Patton became the architect of salvation, the aggressive commander who defied military convention and saved an entire division through sheer audacity. Time magazine, Stars and Stripes, radio broadcasts back to the States, all constructed the same story: Patton the warrior genius, performing miracles while lesser commanders hesitated. The mythology was intoxicating, simple, and fundamentally incomplete. Bradley read the dispatches with the detached irritation of a man watching history be written incorrectly in real time. What the press accounts omitted was the intricate coordination that had made the relief possible. The air support from the IX Tactical Air Command, which had flown desperate resupply missions and close air support sorties the moment weather permitted. The engineers who had cleared routes under fire. The supply officers who had performed logistical alchemy, moving ammunition and fuel through disrupted lines. The unglamorous competence of staff officers whose names would never appear in headlines, but whose work had been absolutely essential. More significantly, the press narrative ignored Bradley's own strategic positioning before the crisis erupted. It was Bradley who had maintained supply depots in Luxembourg that proved critical for sustaining operations. It was Bradley who had insisted on maintaining operational flexibility rather than committing everything to eastward offensives. It was Bradley's command structure that had enabled rapid redeployment when crisis struck. None of this made for compelling journalism, but all of it had been necessary preconditions for Patton's dramatic maneuver. Yet Bradley understood, with the clarity of a professional who had studied military history extensively, that operational reality and historical memory operated by different rules. The public needed heroes who embodied clear virtues: courage, decisiveness, action. They needed moments of dramatic reversal where individual genius changed outcomes. They did not need complex explanations of logistical preparation, institutional coordination, or strategic patience. Patton provided what the public craved. Bradley provided what actually won wars. This dichotomy created a psychological burden that Bradley would carry for decades. In his post-war memoirs and interviews, he would carefully acknowledge Patton's achievements while subtly emphasizing the broader context: the staff work, the coordination, the unsexy competence that made dramatic operations possible. But even as he wrote these qualifications, Bradley knew they would be footnotes to the dominant narrative. History had chosen its hero for Bastogne, and that hero was not Omar Bradley. What complicated Bradley's assessment further was his honest recognition that Patton had in fact performed brilliantly. The speed of the Third Army's pivot was extraordinary by any objective measure. The maintenance of offensive momentum while executing a 90-degree turn was a feat of command and control that demonstrated mastery of mobile warfare. Patton's ability to inspire his subordinate commanders to take risks and maintain tempo was genuine leadership, not just theatrics. The relief of Bastogne was a legitimate achievement that deserved recognition.
Bradley's frustration was not with Patton's competence, but with the disproportionate credit assigned to individual brilliance versus institutional capability. In Bradley's worldview, modern warfare was fundamentally industrial and organizational. Victory came through material superiority, logistical excellence, and the coordinated application of overwhelming force. Individual commanders mattered, but they mattered within systems, not as standalone geniuses conjuring triumph through force of personality. Patton represented an older model of military leadership, the charismatic warrior king whose personal qualities inspired armies and changed history. Bradley represented the emerging model, the professional manager who optimized systems and coordinated complex operations. Both were necessary, but Bradley believed his model would define the future of warfare. Bastogne suggested otherwise, at least in terms of public perception and historical memory. The professional relationship between Bradley and Patton after Bastogne remained functional but increasingly strained. Bradley continued to employ Patton's Third Army aggressively as Allied forces pushed into Germany, recognizing that Patton's drive and aggression were valuable assets in mobile warfare. But Bradley also tightened oversight, limited Patton's operational independence, and ensured that Third Army advances were coordinated with broader strategic objectives rather than pursued for glory. This created predictable friction. Patton chafed under what he perceived as excessive caution and bureaucratic interference. He complained in his diary, which he intended for eventual publication, that Bradley lacked vision and courage, that he was too concerned with politics and too timid in execution. These complaints were unfair but revealing. Patton genuinely believed that wars were won by audacious commanders willing to take risks, and he viewed Bradley's methodical approach as evidence of moral and intellectual weakness rather than strategic wisdom. Bradley, for his part, maintained professional courtesy while privately regarding Patton as a necessary but dangerous tool. In conversations with Eisenhower, Bradley repeatedly emphasized the need to control Patton's public statements, limit his access to press conferences, and prevent him from making political pronouncements that could embarrass the command structure. Bradley was particularly concerned about Patton's tendency to romanticize warfare, to speak in grand terms about glory and destiny, when the reality was industrial slaughter on an unprecedented scale. The fundamental tension between these two men, obscured by the immediate necessities of wartime cooperation, was philosophical. Bradley believed the future of warfare belonged to managers, technicians, and organizational specialists who could coordinate air power, armor, artillery, and logistics into overwhelming combined arms operations. Patton believed warfare remained an art form requiring genius, intuition, and the mystical qualities of leadership that transformed ordinary men into warriors willing to die for causes they barely understood. Bastogne seemed to vindicate Patton's worldview in the public imagination, but Bradley knew the broader truth. The Third Army's relief operation had succeeded because of supply networks established months earlier, because of air superiority won through years of industrial production, because of signals intelligence that revealed German dispositions, because of a logistics system that could move millions of tons of material across an ocean and through a war-torn continent. Patton's aggressive command style had accelerated the timeline and maintained momentum, but it operated within a context of overwhelming Allied material superiority. What Bradley thought when Patton reached Bastogne was complex, contradictory, and revealing of the tensions that would define American military culture for generations to come.
The final assessment, the truth Bradley carried but rarely articulated publicly, was that Bastogne represented both Patton's greatest achievement and the most compelling evidence of his fundamental unsuitability for higher command. This paradox haunted Bradley through the remainder of the war and into the decades that followed. Patton had proven himself capable of extraordinary tactical brilliance, of inspiring men to superhuman effort, of executing operations that defied conventional wisdom. Yet these very qualities were inseparable from character flaws that made him dangerous at strategic levels. Patton's inability to subordinate ego to mission, his tendency to pursue personal glory over operational objectives, his contempt for political considerations that shaped grand strategy, these were not minor defects, but fundamental disqualifications for the highest levels of command. Bradley understood something that the public never grasped and that Patton himself refused to acknowledge. The relief of Bastogne succeeded because Patton was operating within strict constraints imposed by higher command. Eisenhower had defined the mission clearly. Bradley had established the operational boundaries. The logistical infrastructure had been prepared by staff officers who understood supply chains and transportation networks. Patton's genius was tactical execution within a strategic framework built by others. Left to his own devices, unconstrained by careful oversight, Patton would have pursued reckless objectives that endangered broader strategic goals. This became evident in the months after Bastogne, as Patton repeatedly attempted to exceed his operational mandate. He pushed his army beyond sustainable supply lines, seeking dramatic advances that looked impressive on maps but created dangerous salients vulnerable to counterattack. He diverted resources to capture objectives of symbolic rather than strategic value, motivated by competition with British Field Marshal Montgomery rather than military necessity. He made inflammatory public statements about Soviet intentions and post-war politics that threatened the fragile Allied coalition at precisely the moment when unity was essential for final victory.
Each of these incidents required Bradley's intervention: quiet conversations, written orders, threats of relief from command. Bradley played the role of handler, managing Patton's brilliance while containing his recklessness, extracting maximum military value while minimizing political and strategic damage. It was exhausting, frustrating work that received no public recognition because its very purpose was to prevent problems before they became crises. What Bradley truly thought about Patton's role at Bastogne crystallized in the post-war years, as both men wrote memoirs and gave interviews that would shape historical understanding of the European campaign. Bradley was careful, measured, diplomatic in his public assessments. He acknowledged Patton's tactical skill, his aggressive spirit, his ability to inspire troops. But reading between the lines of Bradley's memoirs, particularly A Soldier's Story, reveals a more complex judgment. Patton was a superb corps or army commander in mobile warfare, but he lacked the temperament, judgment, and political sophistication required for theater command or higher strategic positions. The relief of Bastogne had proven this thesis rather than contradicting it. Patton had executed a difficult tactical operation brilliantly, but he had done so within a framework designed by others, supported by resources he did not create, and directed toward objectives he did not select. His contribution was real and valuable, but it was the contribution of a skilled subordinate, not an independent strategic architect. Bradley's assessment was also shaped by watching Patton's post-war trajectory. After Germany's surrender, Patton was assigned to govern Bavaria, where his political ineptitude became immediately apparent. His comments equating Nazi party members with American political parties created an international scandal. His reluctance to aggressively denazify German institutions contradicted occupation policy. His public statements about the need to prepare for war with the Soviet Union threatened diplomatic efforts to establish post-war order. Eisenhower, at Bradley's urging, eventually relieved Patton of this assignment, a humiliation that Patton never forgave. The tragedy of Patton, from Bradley's perspective, was that he had been born into the wrong era. Patton would have thrived as a cavalry commander in the 19th century, leading charges and inspiring men through personal courage on battlefields where individual heroism could change outcomes. But 20th century warfare had become industrial, bureaucratic, and political in ways that required different skills. The modern general needed to coordinate air forces, manage supply chains, maintain alliance relationships, and navigate political constraints. Patton possessed few of these capabilities and resented their necessity. Bastogne had offered Patton a perfect stage, a crisis requiring speed, aggression, and tactical brilliance within a clearly defined mission. He had performed magnificently, and history rightly remembered his achievement. But Bradley knew that this single operation could not be extrapolated into a general theory of command. Most of warfare was not dramatic rescues and audacious maneuvers. Most of warfare was grinding attrition, logistical preparation, coordination of multiple forces toward strategic objectives that unfolded over months or years. This was warfare where Bradley's skills were essential, and Patton's were often counterproductive. The personal dimension of Bradley's assessment was perhaps the most painful. These men had known each other for decades. They had been young officers together, had watched each other's careers develop, had shared hardships and victories. There was genuine affection beneath the professional tension, a recognition of shared experiences that created bonds even when philosophical differences created friction. Bradley did not hate Patton. He mourned the waste of talent misapplied, the tragedy of genius unable to adapt to changing circumstances. When Patton died in December 1945, killed in a traffic accident in occupied Germany, his neck broken in an absurdly mundane collision after surviving years of combat, Bradley felt profound loss mixed with complicated relief. Patton had been spared the humiliation of peacetime irrelevance, preserved in historical memory at the peak of his fame and effectiveness. He would never have to adapt to a military establishment that valued technical expertise over warrior charisma, that promoted bureaucratic competence over tactical brilliance. His legend was secure, frozen at the moment of triumph rather than eroded by the inevitable disappointments of peace. Bradley's final judgment on Patton and Bastogne, articulated privately to close callings but never fully expressed in public forums, was both generous and devastating. Patton had been a great battlefield commander, perhaps the finest tactical leader America produced in World War II, but his greatness was narrow, specialized, and ultimately limited. He was the right man for specific circumstances, but the wrong man for broader responsibilities. The relief of Bastogne was his masterpiece precisely because it played to his strengths while hiding his weaknesses within a larger organizational framework. History would remember Patton as the hero who saved Bastogne through audacious genius. Bradley knew the truth was more complex, that Patton had been one essential component of a larger success, that his brilliance operated within constraints imposed by others, that his achievement revealed both his extraordinary capabilities and his fundamental limitations. And Bradley carried this knowledge into the post-war years, watching as the myth of Patton grew larger, more heroic, more divorced from the complex reality of what actually happened in December 1944. He watched movies that dramatized Patton's exploits, read books that lionized his genius, attended ceremonies that celebrated his legacy. And in each of these moments, Bradley maintained his careful diplomatic silence, acknowledging Patton's achievements while knowing the full story would never be told, could never be told, because the public needed heroes and myths more than it needed uncomfortable truths about the nature of modern warfare and the complex relationship between individual brilliance and institutional capability. What Bradley really thought was this: Patton had saved the 101st Airborne, but it was the American military system, its logistics, its organization, its industrial base, its professional officer corps that had made that salvation possible. Patton was the blade, sharp and deadly and essential, but Bradley and men like him were the hand that wielded the blade, directing its force toward strategic purpose. History celebrated the blade. Bradley understood the hand.